Oh, sure.
It's my favorite Blair Witch scene.
She's very talented in nostril acting.
Yeah,
She's fantastic.
Nostril acting.
Guys, we got a lot to cover. No more nostril acting.
Go,
All right, so today
go.
we're going to talk about the Iranian nuclear deal. Hey, doesn't that sound like fun? Okay, really? You promised you mean it, Brent? Do you mean it? Did you know that, in fact, they didn't sign a treaty? Why is that? Because treaties, FDR was amazing. He goes, you know what, if I go to meet with a foreign government body and I want to talk to them about making some sort of deal, if I call it a treaty, constitutionally there's a vote. So FDR said, you know, we're going to call this an executive agreement. So ever since FDR, they've been calling executive agreements. The big question is, and if you want to read more about this, go to Washington Post. The title of the article is called, Can Congress Stop the Iranian Nuclear Deal? What they have done right now, because this is obviously an issue that people have very strong opinions about, they have decided so that the president, yes, Congress, you can have an up or down vote on the Iranian nuclear deal. But then the president can veto it, and to get past a veto, they'd have to get 2/3 majority, which would be very hard to get. So they do have a vote, but it's kind of a meatless vote. Iranian nuclear deal. This book, I just have been reading this. I'm halfway through. It's called My Promised Land. Boy, if you're curious about the founding of Israel, check this book out, The Triumph and Tragedy of Israel. The reason I wanted to talk about this, I want to talk about more of this next week, but Israel has the nuclear bomb. They started their project back in '67. I thought it was interesting because one of the terms of the Iranian nuclear deal is 24 days. If they want to say, hey, we want to see your facilities, the Iranian government, according to this new deal, says, okay, in 24 days, we can show it to you. There's a lot of people like, in 24 days, you could do a lot of stuff.
You could build a house in 24 days.
So when Israel was working on their bomb, JFK was like, hey, we want to be able to inspect what you're doing. So here's what they did. In order to achieve this goal of building the Israeli nuclear bomb without America knowing, according to non-Israeli sources, simulated control rooms were built, the entrances to underground levels were bricked up, and pigeon droppings were scattered around some buildings in which the forbidden installations were housed to give the impression they were not in use. So anyway, American government, don't let Iran do what Israel did to make us not know that they're building.
They did keep it a secret.
And what's that based off of? Like
this writer, Ari Chafee, his great-grandfather was one of the first founders of the land that became the state of Israel, and then he is a journalist working in Israel. Fascinating, very even-keeled telling of the story, and I'll get into more of that next week. Yesterday, I sat down with presidential candidate Lincoln Chafee, former senator, former governor, and we talked a little bit about the Iranian deal. Here's what he had to say.
It's a great deal. It's so important to what's happening in the Middle East, all the Shia issues and the Sunni issues that we're tamping things down. Instead of a year or so ago, it was all war in Iraq, and we got to bomb Iran. So this is so important, a great breakthrough that we're going to work together and resolve our differences on sanctions and on getting nuclear capabilities. It's great news. And even the most important thing for me is that how we crafted the agreement was with the Chinese, with the Russians, with the French, with the Germans, with UK. That's the best news for me, working with the Chinese and the Russians to get this done, and the Iranians. It's like Nixon going to China. It's good news.
Is there, I've heard concern on both sides about lifting the sanctions, possible influx of cash anywhere between $150 and $200 billion into the Iranian economy. How do we keep that money out of bad guys' hands?
Well, we have to just have some faith that as we go forward, that most people in Iran, what they want is what everybody else wants, and that's a job. They want a roof over their head when the weather's bad. They want, when the child breaks their leg, to go to the clinic and get it fixed. These are just the basics. That's what most Iranians want, and we just have to know that that's what we want, and let's get back on the path with not escalation, not proliferation of nuclear weapons. We don't want people to want to have nuclear weapons. We want to have them taking care of the important things, their education, their health care, their economy.
Were you surprised that the prisoners weren't a part of the deal, the four still being detained in Iran, or was the way it handled, do you approve of that?
I think that can be worked out, Brent. Yeah, that's something down the road that's got to be worked out.
Big thanks to Debbie for setting that up yesterday. You'll see that whole interview, not this Sunday, a week from Sunday. What you'll see Sunday on my half-hour show, this gentleman, Professor Robert Putnam, Reika was here yesterday talking about it as well. Professor Putnam has a new book out called Our Kids, about the opportunity gap between middle-lower class and upper-middle class and their kids. And I want to show this clip. This is Robert Putnam and I talking about his new book, Our Kids. So the title of the book is Our Kids. Explain the title.
Well,
In an earlier America, in the 1950s, in my hometown of Port Clinton, when my parents used the expression "our kids," you know, we've got to have a bond issue here and pay higher taxes so our kids can have a swimming pool or a French department or whatever. When they said that, they did not mean my sister and me. They meant all the kids in town.
All the kids.
And they meant, and they kept doing that when my sister and I were long gone. They still kept, you know, paying higher taxes so that our kids could have a swimming pool and a French department. Now, when people use the term "our kids," they mean my biological kids.
Yeah.
And what's happened over the last 30 years, 40 years in America is a shriveling of the concept of our kids, so that now our kids just means me and mine. Doesn't. And if you talk to people in my hometown, Port Clinton, or anyways across the country, and you talk about poor kids, the typical response is, well, that's not my kids. They're somebody else's kids. Let those other people worry about them. That is the underlying deepest cause of this. And if we began thinking about the fate of these poor kids whose lives are described in this book as really our kids, they were really our kids, you couldn't sleep at night. We wouldn't allow our kids to face the challenges that these poor kids are in America.
Now that lack of community was touched on in your earlier book, Bowling Alone.
Yeah.
So this is the outcome of that concept.
I didn't begin this book knowing that it was a continuation of the earlier book, but I ended up thinking, yeah, that's right. Actually, this collapse of community that I talked about in Bowling Alone, the kids who pay the people who pay the biggest price for that are poor kids. Because as we become more and more self-centered in a literal sense, we're worrying about us and our own kids. The people who pay the price for that are other people's kids, who we ought to think of as our kids. I'm not talking about America becoming Sweden. I'm talking about America becoming just like America has been for most of our lives, worrying about other people's kids as well as our own.
You will see more of my chat with Professor Robert Putnam this Sunday, as well as my chat with Mark Everson, also running for president, the former commissioner of the IRS, the former head of Red Cross. Fascinating chat with him about, since he's former IRS commissioner, does he feel that paying taxes, income tax, is that really American? Is it constitutional? I thought that was fun to talk about. This Sunday, Roske on Politics half-hour show. Be sure to check it out. And I'm actually going to be sitting in your chair tomorrow morning on this show.
Yes, you are. You're going to plug in right here, my friend.
More Roske. We're actually taking the day off. It's just going to be 4 hours.
I got more to talk about
politics.
Iranian nuclear deal all day tomorrow. No, it's not true.
We're going to read you the entire book.
I would watch that. I'm probably the only one, but I would watch that.
All right, it's 9:52. We'll be right back. You're watching Great Day Live on KCWI.